In the shadow of Edinburgh's ancient Holyrood Abbey, where crumbling stones whisper of lost relics and royal secrets, a family gathers to unearth a legendary treasure, the Black Rood. But when a dagger strikes and a body is found in the ruins, Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet wisdom and piercing gaze, steps into a web of greed, betrayal, and hidden motives. As the Strathmore family's secrets unravel, debts, affairs, a contested will, who among them turned history's shadows into a stage for murder? Join Miss Marple in this chilling Agatha Christie-style mystery, where every clue leads deeper into the vanished Abbey's deadly past. Chapter 1. An Invitation from Afar. In the serene village of St. Albans Green, where hedgerows bloomed with late autumn roses, and the church bell tolled with comforting regularity, Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest sitting room at Rose Cottage. The October sunlight streamed through the delicate lace curtains, dappling the polished oak floor with golden flecks. At 72, her frail frame belied a mind as sharp as the needles that clicked rhythmically in her hands, crafting a pair of woolen stockings for her nephew Raymond's wife, Joan. Her blue eyes, bright and inquisitive behind steel-rimmed spectacles, missed nothing, not the sparrow flitting past her window, nor the subtle shifts in human behaviour that so often betrayed hidden truths. Miss Marple's home was a study in understated order. A chintz-covered armchair, a mahogany table bearing a silver tea tray, and shelves lined with well-worn novels and gardening manuals. The village, much like her beloved St. Mary Mead of years past, thrived on routine: gossip at the post office, whist drives at the vicarage, and the occasional scandal over a misplaced inheritance or a straying spouse. Yet, as she paused to adjust a stitch, Miss Marple felt a faint stir of restlessness. The quiet of St. Albans Green, while soothing, lacked the spark of intrigue that so often drew her keen intellect into play. The postman's knock broke her reverie. Mr. Polk, a cheerful man with a penchant for lingering chats, delivered a single letter, its envelope thick and creamy, embossed with the crest of the Earl of Strathmore. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly as she slit it open with a pearl-handled letter-knife. The handwriting was elegant, unmistakably that of Lady Eleanor Strathmore, a friend from her London season decades ago, when Jane was a shy debutante navigating the glittering ballrooms of Mayfair. The two had corresponded sporadically since, their letters filled with reminiscences of rose gardens and mutual acquaintances. This missive, however, carried a different tone, cordial yet tinged with urgency. "My dear Jane," it began, "I find myself in need of your company, and, if I may be so bold, your singular perception. Reginald, my husband, is hosting a gathering at Holyrood Palace to mark his 60th birthday. We shall explore the ruins of the ancient Abbey nearby, a place of mystery and family lore. The Strathmores are a spirited lot, and I fear old tensions may surface. Your presence, with its calming wisdom, would be a godsend. Edinburgh's crisp air will do you good, and I promise you a room with a view of Arthur's Seat. Do say you'll come." Miss Marple set the letter down, her fingers smoothing its edges thoughtfully. Holyrood Abbey. She had read of it in her well-thumbed copy of Scottish Antiquities, a gift from her scholarly friend Canon Pennyfather. Founded in 1128 by King David I, after a miraculous vision of a stag bearing a glowing cross, the abbey had once been a jewel of medieval Scotland, hosting parliaments and royal weddings. Its grandeur had crumbled under the Reformation zeal, and a storm in 1768 collapsed its roof, leaving only gaunt arches and weathered stones. Legends whispered of lost relics, including the Black Rood, a sacred crucifix said to have vanished during the tumult of the 16th century. The abbey's ruins, she mused, were not unlike the human heart, full of hidden corners and buried secrets. Lady Eleanor's words hinted at more than a festive reunion. The phrase old tensions suggested family discord, perhaps over inheritance or some unspoken grudge. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. In her experience, gatherings of the well-to-do were rarely free of undercurrents, much like the tea parties in St Albans Green, where a misplaced word could unravel a web of envy or deceit. She recalled Mrs. Bantry's account of a similar affair at Gossington Hall, where a seemingly innocent dance had ended in tragedy. "People are much the same everywhere," she murmured to her tabby cat Tuppence, who blinked lazily from the hearthrug. Rising, she crossed to her writing desk, its surface adorned with a single photograph of her nephew, and a vase of late-blooming asters. She penned a reply in her neat, sloping hand, accepting the invitation with her characteristic blend of courtesy and reserve. "I shall be delighted to join you," she wrote, "and look forward to the history and charm of Edinburgh." As she sealed the envelope, her thoughts lingered on the Abbey. Ruins, she knew, had a way of drawing out truths, whether of stone or of the soul. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her mind was already turning, like the pages of a novel, toward the Strathmore family and their secrets. She pictured the palace, its tapestried halls echoing with footsteps, and the Abbey's silent stones, guarding their ancient riddles. "A change of scene," she said softly to Tuppence, "may prove most illuminating." Little did she suspect that the vanished Abbey would soon cast its shadow over a modern crime, one that would demand every ounce of her quiet genius to unravel. Chapter 2. Arrival in the ancient city. The train from London to Edinburgh rolled into Waverley Station under a sky draped in a fine Scottish mist, the kind that clung to the cobblestones and softened the city's rugged edges. Miss Jane Marple, bundled in a sensible tweed coat and a hat adorned with a single pheasant feather, stepped onto the platform, her small suitcase gripped firmly in one gloved hand. At 72, she moved with the deliberate grace of one accustomed to observing rather than hastening, her sharp blue eyes taking in the bustle of porters and the distant outline of Edinburgh Castle against the crags. The air carried a crisp bite, laced with the faint tang of coal smoke and the promise of history. A liveried chauffeur, his cap tilted respectfully, approached her. "Miss Marple, Lady Strathmore's car awaits." She nodded, allowing herself to be guided to a sleek Rolls-Royce, its polished chrome glinting even in the dim light. As the car wound through Edinburgh's labyrinthine streets, past Georgian townhouses and narrow closes where gas lamps flickered, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Lady Eleanor's letter. The invitation to Holyrood Palace had been warm, yet its undertones of unease lingered in her mind like a faint discord in a village choir. Families, she reflected, were much like old tapestries. Splendid from a distance, but up close one saw the frayed threads and hidden stains. The car drew up before the palace, its sandstone facade imposing, yet softened by the ivy that curled around its cornices. Holyrood, once home to Mary Queen of Scots, and now a residence for visiting nobility, stood at the foot of the Royal Mile, with the brooding mass of Arthur's Seat rising behind it. Lady Eleanor Strathmore awaited her at the entrance, her tall figure elegant in a tailored wool dress, her silver-streaked hair swept into a chignon. Despite her welcoming smile, her grey eyes held a trace of strain, as though the weight of hosting had already begun to press upon her. "Jane, my dear, how splendid you've come!" Lady Eleanor exclaimed, clasping Miss Marple's hands. "The journey wasn't too taxing, I hope." Her voice was warm, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in it, a detail as telling as a dropped stitch in her knitting. "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but her gaze alert. "The train was most comfortable, and Edinburgh is as striking as I'd imagined." She allowed herself to be led through the palace's grand vestibule, where portraits of Stuart monarchs gazed down with solemn dignity, their eyes seeming to follow the newcomers. The drawing-room, with its high ceilings and tapestries depicting royal hunts, was a blaze of warmth from a roaring fire. The Strathmore family had gathered, and Lady Eleanor made introductions with practised ease. Sir Reginald Strathmore, the Earl, was a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, his ruddy complexion and hearty laugh suggesting a life of good claret and outdoor pursuits. "Miss Marple, is it?" he boomed, shaking her hand with vigour. "Eleanor's told me of your knack for puzzles. Hope you'll enjoy our little family circus." His joviality was infectious, yet Miss Marple detected a flicker of calculation in his glance, as though he were sizing up a guest who might see too much. Next was Captain Hugh Strathmore, the Earl's son, a lean man of 35, with the upright posture of a military officer. His dark hair was neatly combed, but his hazel eyes held a guarded quality, as if he were perpetually on watch. "A pleasure, Miss Marple," he said with a curt nod, his handshake firm but brief. Beside him stood his wife, Lady Beatrice, a striking woman in her late 20s, her auburn hair cascading in fashionable waves. Her smile was dazzling, but her laughter as she responded to a quip from her father-in-law rang with a brittle edge, like china tapped too sharply. Miss Marple noted the way Beatrice's fingers lingered on a sapphire necklace, twisting it as though it were a talisman. Dr. Alan Forbes, the Earl's nephew, was a wiry man in his early 30s, with spectacles perched on a sharp nose and an air of restless enthusiasm. An archaeologist by trade, he clutched a leather notebook, his fingers stained faintly with ink. "Miss Marple, I've heard you're a keen observer," he said eagerly. "Perhaps you'll appreciate the Abbey's mysteries. I'm writing a book on its lost relics. Fascinating stuff." His boyish excitement was endearing, yet Miss Marple caught a hint of defensiveness when Sir Reginald clapped him on the shoulder, joking about treasure hunts. Finally, there was Miss Lydia Grant, the Earl's widowed sister-in-law, a woman of perhaps 50, her mousy hair pinned severely and her grey dress unadorned save for an ornate brooch shaped like a Celtic knot. She offered a murmured greeting, her eyes downcast, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers hovered protectively over the brooch, as if it held some private significance. Tea was served on a silver tray, with delicate sandwiches and scones arranged beside a Wedgwood teapot. As the group settled into plush armchairs, conversation turned to the Abbey, its ruins a short walk from the palace gardens. "It's a family passion," Lady Eleanor explained, pouring tea with a steady hand. "Reginald believes there's treasure buried there. perhaps even the Black Rood, that holy relic lost in the Reformation. The Abbey's history is as tangled as our own, I'm afraid." Her smile was wry, but Miss Marple caught the glance she exchanged with her husband, a silent communication that spoke of unspoken burdens. Sir Reginald leaned forward, his eyes alight. "The Abbey's a gold mine of history, Miss Marple, built by David the Firth, ruined by time and zealots, yet still whispering its secrets. Alan here thinks he's close to a find, aren't you, lad?" Dr. Forbes blushed, muttering about inscriptions, while Captain Hugh's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Lady Beatrice, sipping her tea, remarked airily, "All this talk of relics, I'd rather a new tiara than some dusty cross." Her tone was playful, but Miss Marple noted Hugh's fleeting scowl, as though her jest had struck a nerve. As the afternoon waned, Lady Eleanor proposed a stroll to view the Abbey at dusk, but rain began to patter against the leaded windows, postponing the plan. Instead, the family dispersed to dress for dinner, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She settled into a corner of the drawing-room, her knitting bag at her side, and considered the dynamics she had observed. Sir Reginald's bluff charm masked a controlling streak. Hugh's reserve hinted at suppressed resentment. Beatrice's vivacity seemed a performance. Forbes's zeal bordered on obsession, and Lydia's quiet demeanour concealed what? Grief, perhaps, or something sharper. Lady Eleanor, meanwhile, played the gracious hostessess, yet her eyes betrayed a woman bracing for a storm. Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to St. Albans Green, where Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, had once orchestrated a fête that unravelled into a scandal over stolen funds. "People," she mused, "are much like those ruins, lovely on the surface, but what lies beneath?" The Abbey, with its vanished choir and hidden chambers, seemed a fitting stage for the drama she sensed brewing. As a footman announced dinner, she rose, smoothing her skirt, her mind already tracing the threads of motive and opportunity that would soon entangle the Strathmores in a tragedy as old as the stones themselves. Chapter 3. Whispers Among the Ruins. The morning air was sharp with the scent of damp grass, as Miss Jane Marple joined the Strathmore party at the edge of Holyrood Palace's gardens, where the ancient ruins of the Abbey loomed under a sky swept clean by the night's rain. The skeletal arches of the nave, relics of King David III's 12th century vision, stretched toward the heavens, their weathered stones etched with centuries of wind and rebellion. The Abbey, roofless since its collapse in 1768, stood as a silent witness to Scotland's turbulent past, its crumbling walls whispering of royal intrigues and lost relics. Miss Marple, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path, adjusted her shawl and observed the group with her usual quiet acuity. Dr. Alan Forbes led the way, his wiry frame vibrating with enthusiasm as he gestured toward a broken pillar. "This was the heart of the Abbey," he declared, his voice carrying over the soft moan of the wind. "Here, in the vanished choir, monks once sang vespers and kings held court. During the Reformation, looters stripped it bare, but legends persist of treasures hidden beneath, perhaps even the Black Rood itself." His eyes gleamed behind his spectacles, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands clutched his notebook, as if it held the key to his ambitions. Sir Reginald Strathmore, his tweed jacket straining slightly at the seams, chuckled heartily. "Find that rood, Alan, and we'll be dining with dukes." His joviality echoed off the stones, but Miss Marple caught a glint of avarice in his ruddy face, as though the prospect of treasure was no mere jest. Lady Eleanor, walking beside him, smiled thinly, her gloved hands clasped tightly. "Reginald's always chasing legends," she said to Miss Marple, her tone light, but her eyes shadowed. "The Abbey's a romantic notion, but it stirs up old family quarrels." Captain Hugh Strathmore and Lady Beatrice trailed behind, their steps uneven on the uneven ground. Miss Marple, lingering near a moss-covered arch, overheard their hushed exchange. "You're too quick to dismiss it, Hugh," Beatrice said, her voice sharp as she adjusted her fur stole. "If there's treasure, it could settle everything." Hugh's reply was curt. "Father's dreams won't pay my debts." His face, usually so composed, betrayed a flicker of frustration, and Miss Marple wondered what debts weighed so heavily on the air. Miss Lydia Grant walked alone, her grey figure almost blending with the stones. She paused by a fallen column, her fingers tracing the Celtic knot of her brooch, its intricate design catching the pale sunlight. Miss Marple, ever attentive, noted the gesture, less one of admiration than of nervous habit, as though the brooch were a talisman against unspoken fears. Lydia's eyes darted toward the others, and Miss Marple sensed a solitude deeper than widowhood. Dr. Forbes guided the group toward the eastern end of the ruins, where the foundations of the lost transepts lay half buried in earth. "This area," he explained, "was sealed after the riots of 1560. I've been studying old maps, and I believe a chamber lies beneath, possibly a crypt for relics." His excitement was infectious, yet Miss Marple observed the varied reactions. Sir Reginald's eager nod, Lady Eleanor's forced smile, Hugh's sceptical frown, Beatrice's distracted glance at her reflection in a compact, and Lydia's sudden stillness. As if the mention of a crypt had struck a chord. The group paused for a picnic luncheon in the palace gardens, where a table was set with linen and silver under a canopy of oaks. As they dined on cold pheasant and claret, conversation turned to the Abbey's darker tales. Stories of monks fleeing with sacred treasures, of royal betrayals under its arches. Sir Reginald, his voice warmed by wine, regaled them with a tale of a lost codicil to a family will, rumoured to have been hidden with the Black Rood. "Imagine it, Miss Marple," he said, leaning toward her, "a fortune in one hand, a legacy in the other." She smiled politely, but her mind catalogued the glances exchanged. Beatrice's sharp look at Hugh, Forbes's nervous cough, and Lydia's sudden interest in her plate. As the meal ended, Dr. Forbes proposed a closer inspection of the ruins that afternoon, citing a faint inscription he'd noticed on a buried stone. "It could point to the chamber," he said, his voice trembling with anticipation. Sir Reginald clapped his hands. "Capital! We'll dig tomorrow at dawn. Make it a family adventure." The others agreed, though Miss Marple noted the undercurrents. Hugh's reluctance, Beatrice's feigned enthusiasm, and Lydia's silence, her fingers once more at her brooch. Walking back to the palace, Miss Marple lagged behind, her eyes scanning the ruins. The Abbey, she thought, was like the village green at St. Albans Green, outwardly serene, but a stage for human passions. She recalled a similar scene in her youth, when a treasure hunt at a country fair had ended in a stolen brooch and bitter accusations. People, she murmured to herself, are never so careless as when they think they're unseen. That evening, over a dinner of smoked salmon and venison, the mood in the palace dining room was festive, yet Miss Marple sensed a tightening thread of tension. Sir Reginald toasted the Abbey's mysteries, while Forbes outlined his plans for the dig, sketching diagrams on a napkin. Lady Eleanor, presiding over the table, steered the conversation to safer topics, Edinburgh's festivals, the beauty of the Highlands, but her smile was strained. Hugh and Beatrice sat apart, their earlier argument unresolved, while Lydia excused herself early, pleading a headache. As the party retired, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her knitting in her lap. She reflected on the day's observations. Sir Reginald's obsession with treasure, hinting at financial strain, Hugh's resentment, perhaps tied to his father's control, Beatrice's ambition masked by charm, Forbes's scholarly zeal, possibly a cover for deeper motives, and Lydia's reticence, which spoke of secrets older than the Abbey itself. Lady Eleanor's unease, too, suggested a hostess burdened by more than hospitality. Gazing out at the darkened gardens, where the Abbey's silhouette loomed against the starlit sky, Miss Marple felt the stir of a familiar instinct. "It's like a jigsaw puzzle," she thought, her needles clicking softly. "The pieces are all here, but the picture is still hidden." She retired to her room, unaware that the dawn's dig would uncover not only relics but a crime that would demand her sharpest wits to unravel. Chapter 4. The Fatal Discovery. The dawn broke over Edinburgh with a chill that seeped into the bones, the sky a leaden grey that promised rain. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a thick woolen shawl, stood at the edge of the Abbey ruins, her breath misting in the cold as she watched the Strathmore party assemble near the eastern foundations. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that precedes a storm or a revelation. The group, dressed in sturdy coats and boots, carried an assortment of spades and lanterns, their faces a mix of excitement and unease. Miss Marple, seated on a weathered stone bench, her knitting bag at her side, observed them with her quiet bird-like gaze, noting every gesture, every glance. Dr. Alan Forbes, his spectacles fogging slightly in the damp, took charge of the excavation with the fervour of a man on the cusp of history. "Here," he said, pointing to a patch of earth near the vanished transepts. "The inscription I found yesterday suggests a concealed chamber. It's likely a relic crypt, untouched since the Reformation." His voice trembled with scholarly zeal, but Miss Marple caught the way his hands gripped the spade, as if steadying more than the tool. Sir Reginald Strathmore, his face flushed with enthusiasm, clapped his nephew on the back. "Dig deep, Alan. Let's unearth the Black Rood and make the Strathmores legends." His booming laugh echoed off the ancient stones, but Miss Marple noted Lady Eleanor's tight smile, as though the Earl's exuberance grated on her nerves. Captain Hugh Strathmore stood apart, his military posture rigid, his eyes scanning the ruins as if expecting an ambush. Lady Beatrice beside him adjusted her scarf with a theatrical shiver, her beauty undimmed by the early hour. "All this mud for a myth," she murmured, loud enough for Hugh to hear. He shot her a glance, sharp and unspoken, and Miss Marple wondered what private battles simmered beneath their polished surfaces. Miss Lydia Grant, clutching her Celtic knot brooch, lingered near the edge of the group, her face pale and unreadable, as though the dig stirred memories she preferred to keep buried. Two groundsmen, burly men in tweed caps, began to dig under Forbes's direction, their spades slicing through the damp earth. The group watched in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of metal and the distant cry of a gull. Miss Marple, her needles idle in her lap, studied the scene as if it were a tableau in a village pageant. She recalled a similar moment in St. Albans Green, when a garden fete's treasure hunt had unearthed a stolen locket and a scandal. The earth, she mused, has a way of giving up more than we expect. A hollow thud broke her reverie. One of the groundsmen stepped back, his spade striking stone. "Dr. Forbes, sir," he called. "We've hit something." The group surged forward as Forbes scrambled to the edge of the pit, his lantern casting eerie shadows. With careful scrapes, they uncovered a slab of ancient masonry, its edges worn but intact. "A covering stone," Forbes whispered, his voice thick with awe. "Help me shift it." Sir Reginald and Hugh lent their strength, and with a groan, the slab slid aside, revealing a narrow cavity descending into darkness. Forbes lowered himself into the pit, his lantern swaying. The others peered down, their breaths held. "Good heavens," he called up, his voice muffled. "It's a reliquary, small but intact. Gems on the lid, medieval work, and— Wait!" His tone shifted, sharp with shock. "There's a hand, a skeleton's hand!" Gasps rippled through the group. Lady Eleanor clutched her throat while Beatrice stifled a cry. Forbes emerged, his face ashen, clutching a small ornate box encrusted with dull garnets and silver filigree. Behind him, the skeletal hand protruded from the soil, its bones yellowed by time. Sir Reginald pushed forward, his eyes gleaming. "Let me see that box," he demanded, reaching out. But before he could grasp it, Beatrice screamed, pointing into the pit. There, half buried beside the ancient bones, lay a far more shocking sight. Sir Reginald himself, sprawled face down, his tweed jacket stained dark with blood. A thin, antique dagger protruded from his back, its hilt intricately carved, glinting in the lantern light. The reliquary slipped from Forbes's hands, landing with a dull thud as Lady Eleanor fainted into Hugh's arms. Chaos erupted. Hugh shouted for the groundsman to fetch the police, his voice cracking with urgency. Beatrice sank to her knees, sobbing, while Lydia stood frozen, her fingers white-knuckled on her brooch. Forbes stammered, I didn't see him down there. He was with us." Miss Marple rose calmly, her eyes darting from the dagger to the faces around her. The hilt's design, she noted, bore a striking resemblance to Lydia's brooch, both ornate, both Celtic in style. "A tragedy in such historic surrounds," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the wind. "But who among us would choose so precise a weapon?" Inspector Malcolm Bruce of the Edinburgh Constabulary arrived within the hour, his broad shoulders and stern moustache cutting an imposing figure against the ruins. He surveyed the scene with a practised eye, barking orders to secure the site. Sir Reginald's body was carefully extracted, the dagger left in place for examination. "Stabbed clean through," Bruce muttered to his sergeant. "Death was quick, likely around 10:15 this morning, based on the groundsman's timing." He turned to the group, his brogue firm. "Nobody leaves the palace until I've had answers. This was no accident." As the family was escorted back to Holyrood, Miss Marple lingered a moment, her gaze on the open pit. The reliquary, now in police hands, gleamed faintly, its secrets locked within. She thought of the village blacksmith in St. Albans Green, whose hammer had once concealed a theft. Tools and treasures, she reflected, are only as innocent as the hands that wield them. She followed the others, her mind already sifting through the morning's events. Hugh's absence to fetch tools, Beatrice's distraction with her scarf, Forbes's time in the pit, Lydia's stillness, and Lady Eleanor's faint. One of them, she knew, had turned the Abbey's shadows into a stage for murder. Chapter 5. Shadows of Suspicion. Rain lashed against the tall windows of Holyrood Palace's drawing room, where the Strathmore family sat confined under the watchful eye of Inspector Malcolm Bruce. The room, once a haven of tapestried elegance, now felt oppressively close, the fire in the grate doing little to dispel the chill that had settled over the group. Sir Reginald's body had been removed to the morgue, the Abbey ruins sealed by constables, and the reliquary secured as evidence. Miss Jane Marple, permitted to remain as an impartial guest, occupied a corner armchair, her knitting needles moving with steady precision, though her sharp eyes missed none of the strained faces before her. Inspector Bruce, his moustache bristling with authority, paced before the marble fireplace, his notebook in hand. "The dagger came from the palace armoury," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of rain. "Missing for 3 days, according to the butler." A single thrust to the heart, precise, from someone who knew anatomy or luck. Time of death, between 10 and 10:30 this morning. Alibis, if you please. He began with Captain Hugh Strathmore, who sat rigidly, his military bearing unbroken despite the pallor beneath his tan. "I was fetching additional tools from the garden shed," Hugh said curtly. "Father insisted on more spades. I returned just as Forbes emerged from the pit." His hazel eyes met the inspector's steadily, but Miss Marple noted the mud-free cuffs of his trousers, odd for a man claiming to have crossed the damp grounds. She thought of young Mr. Harmon in St. Albans Green, whose spotless boots had once betrayed a lie about a poaching expedition. Lady Beatrice, her auburn hair dishevelled and her eyes red-rimmed, twisted a handkerchief in her lap. "I was adjusting my scarf near the western arch," she said, her voice trembling. "The wind was fierce. I saw Hugh leave, and then nothing until the scream." Her defence of her husband was fervent. Hugh adored his father, despite their rows over money. He'd never, she broke off, dabbing her eyes, but Miss Marple observed the sapphire necklace still at her throat, its clasp askew as if hastily fastened. Dr. Alan Forbes, spectacles askew and ink stains on his fingers, shifted uncomfortably. "I was in the cavity first," he admitted. "Uncle went down briefly to inspect the reliquary, then climbed out saying he needed air. I stayed below, cataloguing. When I came up, he was there, dead beside the bones." His motive surfaced under Bruce's probing. Sir Reginald had threatened to withdraw funding for his book unless any fines were shared equally. "It was about scholarship, not profit," Forbes protested, his voice rising. Yet Miss Marple recalled his trembling hands earlier, not from cold, perhaps, but from the weight of ambition. Miss Lydia Grant, her grey dress rumpled, spoke softly when questioned. "I watched from the bench with Lady Eleanor," she said, her fingers absently tracing her brooch. "Reginald had accused me of mismanaging my late husband's estate funds. We argued yesterday, but murder? I'm no killer." The inspector's eyes narrowed on the brooch, its Celtic design mirroring the dagger's hilt. "Family, heirloom," Lydia explained faintly. "Many such pieces in the armoury." Miss Marple noted her pallor, reminiscent of Mrs. Dane Calthrop's when village rumours touched too close to home. Lady Eleanor, revived with smelling salts, sat composed but hollow-eyed. "My husband was secretive of late," she confessed, "poring over Abbey maps, muttering about debts and a new will. I was beside Lydia the entire time." Her alibi aligned with Lydia's, yet Miss Marple detected a hesitation, a flicker in her gaze toward the window, as if longing for escape. Bruce dismissed them to their rooms under guard, the palace now a gilded prison. As the group dispersed, whispers followed. Hugh's inheritance now accelerated, Beatrice's potential widow's portion, Forbes's ruined career, Lydia's unresolved grievances, Eleanor's strained marriage. Miss Marple, ascending the grand staircase, pondered the inconsistencies. Hugh's clean boots suggested he hadn't ventured far. Beatrice's scarf was pristine, untouched by wind. Forbes's time alone in the pit allowed opportunity. Lydia and Eleanor's mutual alibi was convenient but unverified by the groundsman, who had focused on digging. In her chamber, overlooking the rain-swept gardens, Miss Marple unpacked her knitting and reflected. The murder required knowledge of the dig's timing, access to the dagger, and a moment when Sir Reginald was isolated, perhaps lured back to the pit with a promise of a private glimpse at the reliquary. "It's like the post office queue," she thought, recalling how Mrs. Blacker had once slipped a forged letter, unnoticed, amid the chatter. "Everyone sees, yet no one truly observes." A knock at her door brought Inspector Bruce, seeking her insights. "You've a reputation, Miss Marple," he said gruffly. "What do you make of this lot?" She smiled mildly. "Human nature, Inspector. Greed, resentment, fear. They twist like ivy on those ruins. But the truth lies in the small things. A clean boot, a twisted clasp, a shared glance." He nodded thoughtfully, departing with a promise of further searches. Alone again, Miss Marple gazed at the Abbey's dark silhouette. The Black Rood, if indeed in that box, had drawn blood anew. Motives abounded, alibis frayed at the edges. One among them had struck in the shadows of history. But which? Her needles clicked onward, weaving patterns as intricate as the case itself. Chapter 6. Threads of the Past. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, cloaking Holyrood Palace in a mournful haze that mirrored the tension within its walls. The Strathmore family, still under Inspector Malcolm Bruce's scrutiny, gathered in the library for further questioning, the room's oak-panelled shelves and leather-bound tomes lending an air of solemnity. Miss Jane Marple sat near a tall window, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the crackle of the fire, her eyes quietly tracing the group's strained postures. The reliquary, now, locked in the inspector's custody, seemed to loom over their thoughts, its promise of the Black Rood stirring motives as old as the Abbey itself. Inspector Bruce, his broad frame filling the doorway, held up a photograph of the dagger, its Celtic-patterned hilt stark against the forensic paper. "This weapon," he said, his brogue clipped, "was no random choice. Taken from the armory, used with precision. Someone here knew its weight, its edge." His gaze swept the room, settling on each face in turn. Miss Marple, her needles pausing, noted the reactions. Captain Hugh's tightened jaw, Lady Beatrice's quick intake of breath, Dr. Alan Forbes's nervous adjustment of his spectacles, Miss Lydia Grant's frozen stillness, and Lady Eleanor's fleeting glance toward the door. Bruce began with Forbes, whose archaeological zeal had made him a natural suspect. "You were alone in that pit," the inspector pressed. "Time enough to lure Sir Reginald down and strike." Forbes paled, his hands twisting his notebook. "I swear, I only wanted the reliquary's secrets for my book. Uncle climbed out before I did. He was alive." Bruce revealed a damning detail. Traces of ink on the reliquary's lid matched Forbes's desk, suggesting he'd handled it before the official discovery. "I touched it to clean it," Forbes stammered. "That's all." Miss Marple, recalling a village chemist caught tampering with labels, noted his defensive tone, less guilt than panic, perhaps. Lady Beatrice, her sapphire necklace glinting in the firelight, was next. Under Bruce's probing, she admitted to a secret that sent murmurs through the room. "Reginald gave me this necklace," she confessed, her voice breaking. "He said it was a token, that he'd ensure my future if the Abbey yielded treasure. Hugh found out, and we quarrelled." Her eyes darted to her husband, who sat stone-faced. "But I'd never kill for it." Miss Marple observed the necklace's clasp, still askew, as if Beatrice had fumbled it in haste or fear. The admission reminded her of a St. Albans Green seamstress, whose secret tryst had unravelled under gossip's weight. Captain Hugh, confronted with his wife's revelation, flushed with anger. Father's affairs were his own ruin, he snapped. He was drowning in gambling debts, promising Beatrice what wasn't his to give. But I didn't need to kill him. I'd inherit anyway. Bruce pressed. Hugh's alibi of fetching tools was shaky. A groundsman recalled seeing him near the pit just before the scream. "I was checking the ropes," Hugh insisted. But Miss Marple noted his clenched fists, much like young Tommy Pierce's when accused of theft at a village fair. Miss Lydia Grant, her voice barely above a whisper, revealed a deeper family secret. "Reginald was my half-brother," she admitted, her fingers gripping her brooch. "Illegitimate from his father's youth. He only told me last year, promising a share of the estate if a lost codicil surfaced, supposedly buried with Abbey relics. He taunted me with it yesterday." The room stilled, and Bruce's eyes narrowed. "So you had reason to want him dead, and that brooch's design matches the dagger." Lydia shook her head. "It's a family piece, like many in the armoury. I was with Eleanor the whole time." Miss Marple, watching closely, saw Lydia's eyes flicker with something, grief or perhaps calculation. Lady Eleanor, her composure fraying, confirmed Lydia's alibi, but added little else. "Reginald was obsessed with the Abbey," she said wearily. "He spoke of debts, of rewriting his will. I tried to calm him, but he was distant." Miss Marple noted her hands, clasped tightly, betraying a tension that went beyond mourning. It recalled Mrs. Weatherby in St. Albans Green, whose calm facade hid a bitter feud over a family trust. Bruce produced the reliquary, now cleaned of earth, its gem-encrusted lid gleaming under the library's chandelier. "Preliminary tests suggest it's 12th century," he said, "possibly holding fragments of the Black Rood. Worth a fortune to the right buyer." He turned to Forbes. "You'd know its value, Doctor." Forbes protested, producing sketches from his notebook to prove his research was legitimate, not a motive for murder. Miss Marple, peering at the sketches, noticed a faint smudge of clay, unique to the pit, on one page, suggesting Forbes had been there before the official dig. As the questioning paused, Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice cutting through the tension. "Inspector, might I suggest examining the pit's surroundings? The clay there is distinctive, and footprints may tell a story." Bruce nodded, making a note. She then turned to Beatrice. "My dear, your necklace, when did you last adjust it?" Beatrice flushed. "This morning, before the dig. Why?" Miss Marple smiled benignly, saying nothing, but her mind catalogued the detail. A clasp askew, yet no wind to dislodge it. The session ended with no arrests, but suspicion hung thick as the rain outside. As the family dispersed to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting resumed. The alibis were fragile. Hugh's proximity to the pit, Beatrice's secret gift, Forbes's ink-stained hands, Lydia's hidden kinship, Eleanor's strained silence. The murder, she mused, was not just about the reliquary's wealth, but something more personal. A betrayal rooted in the family's tangled history. "It's like the church bazaar," she thought, recalling a stolen collection plate that had exposed a web of grudges. The smallest clue, a smudge, a clasp, reveals the heart. She rose, her eyes drifting to the library's window, where the Abbey's dark arches stood sentinel in the rain. The reliquary's secrets, like the family's, were buried deep, but Miss Marple knew that truth, like a stubborn weed, would eventually surface. She retired to her chamber, her mind weaving the day's threads into a pattern that grew ever clearer. Chapter 7. The Gathering Storm. The library of Holyrood Palace, with its towering shelves and the faint scent of old leather, seemed to close in on the Strathmore family as the rain-soaked evening deepened. Lightning flashed beyond the mullioned windows, casting jagged shadows across the faces of those gathered, each a study in unease. Inspector Malcolm Bruce stood by the fireplace, his burly frame silhouetted against the flickering flame, his notebook now worn at the edges from constant use. The murder of Sir Reginald Strathmore hung over the room like a storm cloud, and Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting, observed the scene with the quiet intensity of one accustomed to unravelling human tangles. Her needles moved steadily, but her eyes missed nothing. The tightened lips, the restless hands, the glances that spoke louder than words. Bruce held up a new piece of evidence, a forensic report on the reliquary's inscription. "The carving's fresh," he declared, his brogue sharp. "Ink traces and tool marks suggest it was altered recently, likely to mislead us about the chamber's discovery." His gaze fixed on Dr. Alan Forbes. "Your sketches, Doctor, show the same ink. Care to explain?" Forbes, his spectacles glinting in the firelight, leapt to his feet. "I added a flourish to highlight the find for my book," he protested. "Uncle approved it. I never meant harm." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted his flushed cheeks, reminiscent of a village schoolmaster caught embellishing a ledger to impress the parish. Lady Beatrice, her sapphire necklace catching the light, seized the moment to deflect suspicion. "What of Lydia's brooch?" she demanded, her voice sharp with accusation. "It's a twin to the dagger's hilt. Surely that's no coincidence." Lydia, pale as the marble bust on the mantel, unpinned her brooch with trembling fingers, revealing a concealed blade within, its design indeed matching the murder weapon. "Reginald gave it to me years ago," she whispered. "For protection, he said. I never used it." The room stirred, but Miss Marple observed the blade's pristine edge. No blood, no wear, unlike the dagger's tarnished steel. Captain Hugh, his military composure fraying, scoffed. "Protection from what, Aunt Lydia? Your claim to father's fortune?" His words dripped with scorn, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Albans Green farmer whose inheritance dispute had turned neighbours into foes. Lydia's eyes flashed. "You'd know about greed, Hugh, with your debts piling up." The accusation hung heavy, and Hugh's hands clenched, as if restraining a retort, or a blow. Lady Eleanor, her silver hair loosened by the day's strain, attempted to calm the room. "Enough bickering," she said, her voice weary. "Reginald's secrets caused this, not us." But Bruce pressed her. "You were near the pit, Lady Strathmore. Your alibi with Miss Grant is thin. No groundsman saw you both clearly." Eleanor's lips tightened, and Miss Marple noted her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief, a gesture as telling as Mrs. Price's nervous tugs at her scarf during a village scandal. The inspector produced the reliquary, its gem-encrusted lid now dusted for prints. "We found something else," he said, slicing open its velvet lining to reveal a folded parchment. A codicil to Sir Reginald's will, dated the day before his death. It granted half the estate to Lydia, acknowledging her as his half-sister. Gasps echoed. Beatrice's eyes widened. "So Lydia killed to secure it," she cried. But Miss Marple, her voice soft as a whisper, interjected, "No, my dear, if Lydia wanted the codicil found, why hide it in a reliquary left in the pit? The killer wished it buried, along with Sir Reginald." Bruce's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Miss Marple excused herself, citing a need for fresh air. She slipped into the corridor, her steps deliberate, and retrieved a small evidence bag from her room, a sample of clay from the pit, collected discreetly that morning. Returning, she handed it to Bruce with a murmured suggestion. "Compare this to the family's boots, Inspector. The pit's clay is unique, redder than the garden soil." He nodded, his expression grudgingly respectful. The session broke apart, the family sent to their rooms under guard. Miss Marple lingered, her knitting resumed, as she pieced together the day's revelations. The codicil shifted motives. Lydia gained, but its concealment suggested another's fear of its discovery. Forbes's tampered inscription hinted at a plan to control the find, yet his panic seemed genuine. Beatrice's necklace tied her to Sir Reginald's promises, fueling Hugh's resentment. Eleanor's strained demeanour spoke of deeper wounds, perhaps a marriage frayed by secrets. And the clay, that subtle clue, pointed to someone who had entered the pit unnoticed. As lightning illuminated the Abbey's distant arches, Miss Marple thought of a St. Albans Green fete, where a stolen recipe had sparked a feud. "The truth," she mused, "is like a buried root. Dig carefully, and it surfaces." The codicil, the dagger, the clay, they were threads in a tapestry of betrayal, and one pair of boots, she suspected, would tie them all together. Chapter 8. The Revelation in the Ruins. The storm had passed, leaving the morning air sharp and clear, the Abbey ruins shimmering with dew under a pale October sun. The Strathmore family stood in a tense semicircle near the open pit where Sir Reginald's life had ended, their faces drawn with exhaustion and dread. Inspector Malcolm Bruce, his broad frame commanding the scene, stood beside the excavation site, his stern moustache twitching as he surveyed the group. Constables flanked the family, their presence a quiet reminder of the law's unyielding grip. Miss Jane Marple, her woolen shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, stood slightly apart, her knitting bag at her feet. Her blue eyes, keen as ever, traced the group's every gesture, as if reading a familiar script from her years in St. Albans Green. Bruce raised a hand, his voice cutting through the morning's hush. "We've answers today," he declared, his Scottish brogue resolute. "Miss Marple has pieced together the truth. Let's hear her." The family turned, some with wary curiosity, others with barely concealed fear. Miss Marple stepped forward, her small figure belying the weight of her words, her voice soft yet clear, like a village bell tolling a warning. "This murder," she began, "is rooted in the oldest of human frailties, love turned to venom, trust to treachery. Sir Reginald's death was no hasty act, but a careful plan, woven into the Abbey's shadows. The killer knew the dig's precise moment, stole the dagger from the armory days before, and lured him to the pit with a whispered promise, perhaps of a secret find. The strike was swift, delivered in the flicker of distraction when all eyes were elsewhere." She paused, her gaze sweeping the group. "Captain Hugh, your debts and your father's promises to Beatrice stirred resentment, yet your boots bore no trace of the pit's red clay, a silent alibi. Lady Beatrice, the necklace tied you to Sir Reginald's indiscretions, but your scarf, pristine despite the wind you claimed, suggests you stayed clear of the pit. Dr. Forbes, your altered inscription hinted at deceit, but your sketches, smudged with honest toil, speak of scholarship, not murder. Miss Lydia, the codicil promised you wealth, yet hiding it would have undone your gain. Your motive points elsewhere." Her eyes settled on Lady Eleanor, whose elegant poise had crumbled, her silver hair catching the light like a fading crown. "Lady Eleanor, it was you. The pit's unique red clay clings to your boots alone, unnoticed by others in the chaos. You learned of Reginald's affair with Beatrice, a wound that festered through years of humiliation. Worse, he discovered your own secret, diverting estate funds to a lover in London, a betrayal he threatened to expose with divorce and disgrace. The codicil, naming Lydia his heir, was the final cut. It left you nothing. You acted to bury both it and him." A collective gasp broke the silence. Eleanor's face collapsed, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl. "He deserved it!" she cried, her voice raw. "His affairs, his debts, his taunts, I endured them all. I used Alan's ink to forge the inscription, swapping his sketches to steer the dig. When Reginald descended alone, lured by my whisper of a find, I followed with the dagger hidden in my cloak. One strike, and it was over. The Black Rood was to fund my freedom, sold far from this cursed place." Bruce nodded, holding up a forensic report. Eleanor's fingerprints marked the dagger. Her boots matched the pit's clay. Constables stepped forward as she sank to her knees, her confession spilling like the rain that had soaked the ruins. Hugh stood frozen, his arm around a tearful Beatrice, their rift softened by shock. Forbes clutched his notebook, his scholarly dreams intact but chastened. Lydia, gazing at the codicil now in Bruce's hands, murmured of a legacy she'd never sought. Miss Marple turned her eyes to the Abbey's arches, their ancient stones unmoved by modern tragedy. "Human nature," she said softly, almost to herself, "is like these ruins, enduring, yet scarred by its own desires. A little observation, and the truth rises from the dust." As Eleanor was led away, the family dispersed, their steps heavy with the weight of resolution. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and returned to the palace, her thoughts already drifting to St. Alban's Green. The Abbey's secrets, like those of her village, had yielded to patience and a keen eye. By noon she was on a train south, the Edinburgh mist fading behind her, her needles clicking once more, weaving peace from the threads of chaos.